The crowd mocked the Mafia boss's autistic son's speech until she took the microphone and turned the room silent. The air in the opulent Moretti ballroom was thick with control, a velvet trap scented with expensive perfume and fear. Elena Caruso moved with practiced invisibility among the guests, her uniform sharp, her presence muted. She was service staff. She saw everything and was expected to report nothing. Her eyes kept returning to the stage, where Vincenzo Moretti, a man whose stillness held more threat than any shout, pressed his son, Luca, toward the microphone. Luca, a boy scrubbed and contained in a suit clearly too heavy for him, stood rigid, a small, fragile figure under the blinding lights. This was the dawn spectacle, a forced display of superficial conformity. As Luca began his rote, prepared speech, his voice a nervous, high-pitched monotone, the silence of the crowd transformed from polite anticipation into cruel expectation. He stumbled over a complex noun. It began subtly. A guest near the front exchanged a quick, cold glance with her neighbor, and then a polished cough attempted to smother a mocking snicker. Luca froze, his fingers clutching the silver microphone stand as the room's collective disdain began to bubble up into undeniable, malicious laughter. That sound, the sound of the powerful preying on the weak, shattered Elena's self-imposed silence. Her tray dropped, the soft thud of metal on carpet the loudest noise in the suddenly breathless room. She broke rank, ignoring the desperate pleas in the eyes of her fellow staff, and rushed forward. She knelt quickly, meeting Luca's terrified gaze, and gently pried the microphone from his grip. A servant had just seized the voice of the ballroom. The crowd, and the terrifying Don himself, fell utterly silent, waiting for the consequence. The ballroom was an aquarium of power, clear and suffocating. Every breath Elena took was calculated to be silent, every step measured to avoid disrupting the delicate ecosystem of wealth and fear. She moved between the tables, catching snippets of conversation, casual references to fortunes made through unseen machinations and veiled criticisms of absent rivals. The guests, dressed in fabrics that screamed exclusivity, wore faces of serene hypocrisy, their smiles fixed and their eyes cold. Elena understood the environment better than any of them. She was the shadow who saw the true cost of their composure. Her focus kept pulling her to the far end of the room, to the small platform where a lone microphone stood. Near it, Vincenzo Moretti was a monument of immaculate tailoring and terrifying control. He didn't need to shout. His authority was the air pressure in the room. Beside him, Luca was a knot of anxiety, a miniature man in a stiff tuxedo that looked less like a garment and more like a constraint. The boy's skin was pale against the black collar, and he nervously smoothed the sides of his hair, his movements small and repetitive. Elena could feel the transaction happening just by watching Vincenzo lean down and speak to his son. The gesture meant to look encouraging but carrying the invisible weight of a command. There was no warmth there, no fatherly affection, only the cold, calculating pressure of a man forcing a vulnerable part of himself into a performance of normalcy for the sake of his reputation. Luca wasn't about to give a speech. He was about to be put on display, proof that even the Don's anomalies could be bent to his will. Elena paused behind a pillar, wiping down a wine bottle she knew was already spotless. She recognized that look on Luca's face, the desperate, internalized plea to be invisible. But here, tonight, under the 100-watt scrutiny of the city's elite, invisibility was the one thing he would be denied. The weight of the room pressed down, a collective expectation of cruelty and judgment, and Elena felt the familiar, sharp ache of empathy that she worked so hard to suppress. The clock was ticking, and the moment the spectacle began, that oppressive silence would give way to either forced applause or, far more likely, corrosive mockery. She just wished she could make him vanish. Vincenzo gave his son a final, silent order, and Luca, stiff-legged and trembling, was ushered onto the small platform. The applause that followed was thin and obligatory, the sound of hands striking leather gloves, not true admiration. Elena moved strategically toward the kitchen exit, the nearest escape route, her stomach tightening with the dread that coated the air. She hoped for a miracle, that Luca would find his voice, or that the dawn would, for once, show mercy and call the charade off. Neither seemed likely. The boy's grip on the microphone was white-knuckled as he stared over the sea of judgmental faces. He cleared his throat, a small, high sound amplified harshly by the sound system. Then he began, a rush of memorized syllables meant to impress. Esteemed members of the committee, I stand before you tonight to address. The words were too fast, delivered in a strained, unnatural rhythm. It was a performance built on terror. Elena watched his eyes dart, desperate to find an anchor, yet unable to meet the gaze of the powerful people watching him falter. The tension was immense, a heavy, silent net closing around the boy as his prepared facade started to crumble. Every labored breath was a countdown. Luca reached a dense, multi-syllable word, jurisprudence, and the effort of forcing it out under duress caused his delivery to shatter. He stumbled, the word catching in his throat like grit. The small fissure in the performance was all the guests needed. A woman in a charcoal gown, one of the prominent wives seated near the front, brought her hand to her mouth, and what started as a polite cough transformed, unmistakably, into a sound that barely masked a condescending laugh. It was sharp, high, and cruel, amplified by the sudden silence that Luca's failure had created. The sound struck Luca like a physical blow. He froze, his entire body locking up, the prepared speech now wiped clean from his memory. His wide, terrified eyes swept the room, meeting only the collective, smug satisfaction of the elite. The social force field of strained politeness that had held them back instantly collapsed, replaced by a wave of active mockery. More whispers followed, hands covered mouths, and eyes exchanged knowing, ugly amusement. Elena felt a blinding heat rush through her chest. It was no longer about duty, no longer about survival, or even the fear of the Morettus. It was about the monstrous pettiness of the powerful, delighting in the humiliation of a helpless child. The line she had drawn for her own moral survival snapped. She saw Luca's pain, and every instinct of self-preservation crumpled into a protective rage. She was done being invisible. The delicate, ironed napkin crumpled silently in Elena's fist for a moment. Then she let it go. It hit the marble floor with a quiet, deliberate thwomp, a sound that, in the immense vacuum of the room's scorn, felt like an explosion. Every nerve screamed at her to freeze, to retreat, to remember the unwritten, lethal laws of the Moretti operation. Stay invisible, stay alive. But the image of Luca's paralyzed face, drowning in the crowd's petty cruelty, ignited a defiance stronger than survival. Ignoring the horrified, sidelong glances of her fellow waitstaff, she began to walk. It wasn't a rush, but a resolute, straight line toward the stage. The shift was instantaneous and visceral. The entire energy of the ballroom, which had been focused on mocking Luca, snapped to her. She felt the heavy, collective weight of their gaze, a mix of confusion, shock, and rising fury that a servant would dare interrupt the spectacle. She was no longer a ghost. She was an audacious violation of their rigid social order. Vincenzo Moretti, standing rigid and watching, was the first to realize the magnitude of her action. His gaze, colder than the ice in the guests' abandoned champagne glasses, locked onto her. Elena didn't waver. Every step carried her deeper into the crosshairs, transforming her from a faceless utility into an enemy of the Don's authority. She reached the edge of the platform, prepared to seize not just the stage, but the narrative itself. Elena reached the small stage and moved with a swift, economical grace that belied her terror. She dropped to one knee beside Luca, deliberately lowering herself to his eye level. The boy was shaking, his eyes glazed with trauma, his hand fused around the chrome microphone stand. The world had vanished for him, replaced only by the buzzing shame of his failure. She didn't speak a word to the crowd. Her focus was absolute. Her own hand, calloused from years of service, covered his small, rigid knuckles. Gently, deliberately, she eased the heavy microphone from his grip, prying his fingers open without breaking eye contact. She offered him a brief, fierce, and utterly genuine smile, a gesture of pure solidarity that cut through the oppression of the room. It was the first true kindness Luca had received all night. The crowd of powerful people was frozen, a gallery of stone faces, watching the servant usurp the floor. Their shock was total. The sheer audacity of the gesture, a woman in an apron kneeling before the dawn's sun, claiming the microphone, had generated an absolute, perilous silence. Elena felt the humming tension of hundreds of eyes fixed on her. She had the voice of the room, and as she looked into the stunned faces of the elite, she knew her next words would determine everything. Elena lifted the microphone, not to her mouth, but holding it low, near Luca's ear, a grounding presence. When she spoke, her voice was not the high, nervous sound of a servant, but clear, resonant, and entirely composed. It wasn't loud, yet it carried over the stunned silence, commanding attention through sheer moral force. She didn't begin with an apology or a defense of the boy. She began with an indictment of the room. "Look at him," she said, her eyes sweeping over the frozen faces of the elite. "You came here tonight to witness power, but you have only displayed your weakness. You watch a child struggle, a child who is doing the bravest thing in this room, trying to use his voice, and your response is not patience, not kindness, but mockery." Her voice held a surprising, cutting eloquence. "You, who sit in judgment, celebrating your own elevated status, reveal yourselves as cheap, petty spectators. You require perfection to grant a single moment of dignity. Your wealth is immense, but your empathy is bankrupt." She forced them to look at their own monstrous behavior, stripping away the veneer of their politeness and exposing their cruel satisfaction. The silence deepened, charged now with humiliation and impotent rage. Every guest felt the unexpected sting of the servant's words, and all of it was directed squarely at the Don, for allowing this treason to continue. The indictment hung in the air, a poisonous silence that could only be broken by an act of definitive force. From his position, Vincenzo Moretti began to move. He didn't rush or shout. He simply walked toward the stage, and the effect was overwhelming. His massive bodyguard, the towering figure in the tailored suit, shifted immediately, his hand easing toward his jacket. Every eye in the room tracked the Don's controlled, terrifying approach. He was an overwhelming physical presence, the embodiment of the absolute authority Elena had just shattered. Elena finished her thought, her voice unwavering until the very end. She gently squeezed Luca's hand, placing him slightly behind her kneeling frame, a fragile, human buffer. Then, she turned her entire focus to Vincenzo. He stopped directly before her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his polished facade. His face was a mask of cold fury, all pretense of composure stripped away. In the absolute, breathless silence, their eyes locked, the master and the servant, the apex of power confronting pure, protective resolve. She offered no apology, no plea, only the fierce, steady gaze of a person who had already accepted the price of her action. The climax was this silent, intense stare down, a battle of wills where the stakes were everything, with Luca trapped, trembling, between them. The silence stretched, agonizing, between them. Every breath Elena took was an act of defiance, waiting for the brutal finality of his command. But Vincenzo Moretti was not a man of predictable violence. His fury was ice, not fire. He didn't raise his voice. Instead, He leaned closer, his eyes boring into hers, and whispered a line that carried more menace than any threat. "Courage in my house is not cheap, Elena," he murmured, his voice cutting through the stillness like shattered glass. "Now you owe me a debt of silence." The chilling pronouncement was not a dismissal, but a claim. She had earned his notice, and now she owed him. He gave a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture to the massive bodyguard, who moved with practiced swiftness. The guard didn't attack her. He gently took her arm, a surprisingly measured action, and began to escort her away from the stage. As she was guided back through the stunned, murmuring crowd, Elena looked down at Luca one last time. The boy's trembling had subsided. He looked not at the retreating form of his terrifying father, but at her. In his wide, vulnerable eyes, there was no shame or fear, only a raw, profound look of silent gratitude and a sudden, deep connection. In that single, fleeting moment, she knew she had won something infinitely more valuable than her job or her anonymity. The cool night air was a shock after the overheated ballroom. The bodyguard had delivered Elena to the sidewalk with quiet, surgical efficiency, a final confirmation that her employment was instantly and irrevocably terminated. She was alone, the roar of the city replacing the oppressive silence of the elite gathering. She had no job, no severance, and the terrifying knowledge that she had directly defied Vincenzo Moretti in front of his entire network. But she felt no regret. The fear was overwhelmed by a potent, electric sense of self-possession. She had chosen to use her voice, and she had saved the boy from shame. As she fumbled in the pocket of her apron, pulling off the crisp uniform she was expected to return, her fingers brushed against something small and soft. She pulled it out, the cheap, foam wind filter, the microphone cover she had inadvertently pocketed when she seized the voice from Luca. It was a worthless scrap of foam, yet it felt like a talisman. She realized her escape was an illusion. She hadn't left the Moretti family's influence. She had merely escalated her involvement. She was no longer an invisible servant. She was a variable unknown asset or a perceived threat. Clutching the soft, foam scrap, Elena knew her single moment of defiance had ensured she can never truly be silent again. The room went silent, but Elena's future just got loud. "You've witnessed a moment of pure, dangerous courage." Elena sacrificed her safety to protect a child from the very shadows that run her city. Now, the Dawn knows her name. What happens when the servant who spoke is forced to pay the debt of silence? If you believe that the vulnerable deserve a voice, and if you can't wait to see how Elena navigates the terrifying consequence of crossing the Mafia boss, hit that subscribe button and let the algorithm know that courage deserves to be seen. Tap the like button if you stand with Elena against the cold cruelty of the powerful. May the light of truth always shine on your screen, and may your own inner courage be amplified 1,000-fold. Don't stay silent. Subscribe now.